This is Antithesis, your underground academic radio where the focus is on you. For those that are in the thick of it today, we know what you are living through. And for those that chose or were forced onto a different path, we know what it costs. We're here to be your companion and to help you reorient your compass a bit, to help make sense of it all. Thanks for being here. The opinions expressed here are my own and do not reflect those of my employer or any entity professionally affiliated with me. Topics in these podcasts will be familiar to many, if not all, within the academic and scientific communities, within institutions, industries, and employers of all kinds. Some of these topics may be of a highly sensitive nature to certain listeners, particularly those that have experienced or are experiencing them, and could trigger some emotions that are upsetting or distressing. I've created this space to speak openly about these topics with the broader goal of helping individuals cope, adjust, and adapt constructively to the many challenges at hand. With that said, thank you for joining me. Antithesis, Episode 7, Rainmaker. Hello everyone, thanks for joining me today. Since the last episode, I've been spending some time regathering and reviewing information from the past years, much of it from long ago, to get a bit more organized for some of my creative pursuits, but also provide a bit more detailed context for what I want to share with you today. Some of the history, experience, and reflections I want to describe stick out in my mind clear as a bluebird day, or maybe more accurately, are scorched into my neural circuitry. However you look at it, abrupt and impactful memories are pretty much unforgettable. But I came to realize that some of the in-between periods of my past experiences and recent reflections all blur together to match the same general and sometimes difficult overarching aura of the path and process I experienced. But here, it is crucial for me to admit to myself and anyone listening that I'm actually quite relieved and even appreciably thankful that the passage of time was somewhat unfair to my recollection and wholesale emotions of everything that transpired as I was running the gauntlet to be hired for a faculty position at a large research university, what are generally called Research 1 institutions. Now, for listeners that did not pursue PhDs or even attend college, much of what I describe today will no doubt sound somewhat familiar for most who've applied for jobs where you need to interview with just a boss or a manager, but also sometimes with entire groups or committees of people to earn their approval and be hired. And here, like I will continue to do so in future episodes, I'm going to broach some topics that make this type of endeavor intense and possibly even sound a bit insane, particularly in academia and seeking approval to merit what is deemed to be a highly coveted role. And I think that again, because some or even most reasonable folks would not argue that when we speak of colleges, universities, higher learning, academies of research, and unfortunately that term, which has become over the past years, or maybe it always has been, a representation that means far more negative than positive, the quote unquote ivory tower. When we think of these words, it should not be off base for anyone to believe that the processes and procedures of these places would be reasonable, fair, and maybe even honorable. But it is important to underscore two things here, yet again, before I continue. First, these operations are run by people through a top-down hierarchy, and with people come all the pros and cons and ups and downs, like anywhere else. But second, and importantly, this is akin to saying the sky is blue or water is wet. So, as I've already shared, we'll do so today and do further in coming episodes. I feel it is paramount to talk openly about what could be seen and experienced and how this might have an impact on you if you'll be following this pursuit, or did have an impact on you if you tried or are continuing to try or even successfully landed this job of your dreams. As I've already alluded to earlier, I can say that coming back so many years later to read through some emails and look at all the files and efforts of all my failures and success, that I admit how compressed it can all become. Almost like an all or none feeling of pain, all blurred together. And this was admittedly the case for me. So for some of you, how you feel or what you feel might be different. And I absolutely expect that to be the case. But I hope today I can share with you some thoughts and perspectives that will help keep you checked in to yourself and lifted up, no matter what you see and who you meet, sometimes for better, sometimes not. And particularly those of you that are right in the thick of it, whether it is going for any new job of any kind or working to score a faculty position. I also confess, working right at the stovetop where the heat is blasting, and it feels like you are fighting for your professional life and dreams, can make it nearly impossible to reflect positively when things with your job applications and or interviews are not going the way you hoped they would. Bearing that truth in mind, maybe today will be helpful merely in you hearing that again, you aren't alone, you aren't the first, you won't be the last, and that there is solidarity to be had with me and everyone else that has chosen to swallow the pill of pursuing that next big job, particularly the jobs that might seem, because of many factors, unattainable. As I presented in episode 4 entitled Prizes, my very first faculty chalk talk kicked off with me being asked the unenviable question: how will mathematical modeling win you the Nobel Prize? I have to state here, for some of you, maybe my own issue with this question resonated with you. For others, you might just be the person to be completely gung-ho with answering that question without hesitation. And some of you, particularly non-scientists in the audience, might be completely confused about why that could be considered by some, including myself, to be a problematic question. But herein is the point. It's all about the eye of the beholder, who else is beholden to a situation, and all the differing perspectives that come with it. And with this first example in mind, what could be said for how to prepare for the expected? But beyond that, how one could be prepared for the unexpected. And I'm not talking about the ability to answer every single question asked of you. It's a critical tenet for us all to make sure we're capable of saying, I don't know, for questions out of your reach, no matter how uncomfortable it might be to do so. And this is a common interview question in and of itself. How do you handle answering a question or dealing with a challenging situation you haven't experienced before? Those are clear things that we want to be prepared for. But what I'm speaking of here is when it comes down to personalities and factors that are simply out of your control. And I don't just mean only your personality or your counterpart's personality that is interviewing you. Now we're talking about each of you and all the chemistries that might work for or against you in just that dynamic alone. Then we multiply that dynamic by 5, 10, 15, even 20 people that you could end up interviewing with, the deciders, the decision makers. So even keeping that in mind, and this is going to seem so obvious to anyone listening to this, but again, when you're going through the fire and brimstone, number one, of desiring a position, a job so badly, maybe it's dependent on the conditions of your life at that very moment. And then you have to take into account and consideration, who is it that I'm dealing with? How's their day been? What did they have for breakfast? Did they fight with their significant other? I mean, in retrospect, these things seem so obvious, but all I can say here is to go in and to acknowledge the fact that you're speaking and working and interacting with individuals and people that already might have a positive bias towards you or less so. And what is their attitude? What is their mood on that specific day? I want to just empower any of you that are new at this, going in, interviewing for these positions, taking on these challenges, to keep that in mind, because if things don't go the way you're hoping and you feel that there's something off, that should set off some alarm bells for you immediately. And you can reflect on that and adapt as best as possible and not let it drag you down in the moment. This makes for complicated facets. Can you answer all the questions you were asked? Will you provide those fantastic insights that each individual wants to hear? But then you need to tie into that. The fact is, this is a human endeavor. And whomever you are, trying to find a place with these people, wherever that may be. But I admit, there's nothing worse than that sinking feeling at the beginning, middle, or near the end of an interview where suddenly you realize this person or these people are just not aligned with me. And that can be heartbreaking. But we've got to get you to move on, move forward, and on to the next one. Looking back on past agendas and itineraries for my own faculty job interviews with both wonderful and, for lack of a friendlier word, woolly folks with which I interacted, it's exactly as one could, would, and should expect. There were humans, and those still around are still human. And for me, time passing and seeing trajectories and outcomes of some of those that at the time had my fate in their hands. Maybe one word is antidote from some of the emotions and struggles I so vividly recall and attribute to some of the experiences. But for those of you listening that are younger and at the point of process where you are going through it or maybe stealing your reserve in preparation to go through it, a precept for you to hold and even to cling up to at times with whatever and whomever you face during your pursuit. So I want to leave you with the precept today. Let's get to it. To begin with, following through with that first interview and that first interview question, facing such extreme skepticism, it was my first faculty interview. I remember doing all I could to exude politeness, openness, and welcome skepticism in a way where I'd present the opportunity to the skeptic. Let's take your example and work to break it down. I remember using those exact words. As a highly experienced instructor and teacher, for me, practices in the classroom on scientific topics, broad or focused, were not unknown to me. And it was always so immensely important to do my best to relate to my audience and to cater to individuals as much as I possibly could with as much energy as I could provide. Though there was no way I could fully know my audience at the time, sometimes I wondered if I ever came across too nice, too agreeable, and honestly too willing. I made it a point after each interview to email each of the faculty members with which I interviewed, whether it would be deemed advisable or not. But I felt it was a small gesture to no less than show my gratitude for their time, and I felt that sincerely. I received an email from a faculty member that offered the following criticism following my interview period at that institution that I knew was meant to be constructive, but it still stung. And they said, I quote, "If you knew how to present your material and better connect your listeners, you could be a top candidate." And honestly, the email was friendly and it was constructive, but all I could recall was how much energy and time and passion I devoted to do all I could to connect as best as I could. Now, I did mention in the prior episode that I returned home after this interview and immediately knew I needed to cut out a section of my presentation, but I was also needing to continue to adjust and remain as flexible as possible mentally for whomever my audience and its individuals would be. In this moment, to share some of that precept that I mentioned earlier, and part of it, which could seem so cliche, but it is absolutely important in practice, not just in principle. And here it is, the first part. You need to be yourself while finding the best way or ways to help accommodate the broadest range of personalities possible. Even then, there's no way anyone could ever be perfect. And by perfect, I mean that every single human sitting in front of you will be thrilled with what you are and what you do. Let's just be honest with each other. You're not going to attain that kind of perfection. You're never going to make everyone happy. Our expertise is different. Our experiences are different. Even in the same scientific disciplines, our science is different. And for non-scientists and non-academics, these same rules apply. Who you are and what you do and how you do it and all of your experience is different. But the reality here is just like with favorite hypotheses and the dangers that come with them when scientists like to roll that way, you making yourself fit into an unnatural presence, you make yourself fit into an unnatural way to get a job will only lead to bigger struggles eventually. And we each need to be valued for who we are and what we bring. Those were really some first important lessons. And it was disappointing, didn't get the job offer, and we moved on to the next. The next institution I interviewed with was closer to the East Coast. I had contact with the chair of the department of the program at that time, and they were incredibly kind and affable. And actually, not long after I submitted my application, had gotten an email just for conversation, just see how I would fit. And so it was really intriguing and a positive step. So that was a really great way to kick things off. I remember meeting a faculty member, so many people, wonderful and really friendly and affable, self-effacing. I remember having a conversation. I just said, what is the one thing that you wish you would have had better training on? You know, now that you're this new assistant professor. And he was very honest, budgeting. I wish I knew how to handle numbers better. And, you know, that was a relief because I always really loved to keep track of what I was spending and what I was doing even back prior to becoming a faculty member. But that honesty was really refreshing to hear. And he showed concern as he was describing this to me. So I really took that to heart. So there were some great experiences. I go into another interview at the same place, at the same institution, and this individual says to me, all the equipment you see in this laboratory and many of these spaces in our department is because of me, because I'm the Rainmaker. And I was like, okay, sir, I am not just impressed by you. I'm really proud of you. To be a part of your team, how fantastic. But this was just not something I'd ever expected to hear and nothing I'd heard thus far in any of my interviews. He had seen my presentation. He had said to me, you work in control systems. That's what you work on, correct? I mean, I can just tell. You didn't say it, but that's what you do. And once again, it was just this type of overpowering personality where I'm there to participate in that conversation and discussion. And he'd labeled himself. He was the one, an overpowering, all-knowing individual. And clearly, without him in that department, there'd be no equipment. And just that was one of those examples it's just also really set me back. So nonetheless, looking back on past email exchanges I had, I met some really fantastic people. There were always some wonderful people everywhere that I went. That was just one instance where I thought, okay,
you're the Rainmaker, note taken, duly noted. I think I emailed him a thank you and I never heard back. Then I had an interview at what might be deemed one of the most prestigious institutions in the US, one of the pretty top ones. And this was an intense experience. Every personality was ratcheted up, and the pervasive feeling I garnered from every single interview, and the days were packed, 2 straight days of visits with different faculty, was that there was not a lot of sunshine and happiness in that community. Gave my presentation, for me listening as much as I could and riffing off what was being said and applying from my experience, but also if I had questions, I'd ask them. But this was just an entirely different tone. And one more time goes back to sort of an earlier discussion in an earlier podcast of depending on where you are and how folks feel, that spotlight can be bright and it can burn, but it doesn't necessarily lend a lot of happiness to where you are. So my whole interview, my whole couple days ended, and the very last words I heard from the chair of the institute with which I was interviewing, quote, "I really thought you were going to talk about proteomics," end quote. Now, proteomics is a whole broad different set of tools that you can use to study proteins and what they do in cells and how they function. I mean, so many different factors of what proteomics means. Again, here we are ending on a comment about a set of tools that can be employed to perform scientific studies and analyses of biological systems, kind of like saying, how is AI going to win you the Nobel Prize? How are we going to handle this? And the fundamentals of all the questions and topics I described pursuing during my faculty presentation and all my interviews were bolstered by intense quantitative studies. But the fact that I didn't describe some equipment and define the word proteomics to this individual's liking in that moment, I was left standing there with a blank face. And I responded, each of the questions I want my lab to pursue are all based on proteomic principles. I just felt for me it was better to express a decade or longer of research directions than simply saying, these studies will eventually require deep proteomic analyses. Let's break this down. Here's the equipment we'll be using to do this work. But again, the eyes and the ears of the beholder. And I didn't want to hinge all of my future work just merely based on even one broad specific topic area. I didn't really want to spend any time on that because I felt like I need to talk about 10 years of forthcoming research that's, around the corner. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the first portion of the precept I wish for you to hold close to you is to be yourself and as acceptably adaptable as possible without giving yourself away. So here we are at the second key part of this precept. These people aren't perfect either. They were and are still human, just like everyone hammering away in the job market, past and present, trying to find a match and a home, even those with homes, and those with what might be called blustery personalities don't always get to stay. And they don't all continue publishing. And they don't all keep their funding. Hence, they don't all keep their labs running. And they don't all end up staying in academia, whether by choice or by force. Sure, some of them may have been rainmakers. A few of them could still be rainmakers. But for any true academic researcher, the demands and requirements for sustaining independent research programs for years and years on end are abundantly clear. How challenging that is. And that is the real challenge and true goal that far surpasses the gleam of any prize as what should be made the true priority. So, with the culmination of those earlier stories, indeed, I managed to find an academic home. And without a doubt, I was able to be myself to the best of my capability during my interviews and visits with another institution. But in no way was it perfect. And for me, again, maybe just a matter of trying too hard, trying to do too much to feel like I could fit everyone's bill. And a perfect example of what happens when your mind becomes so wound up, your shirt is sweaty, and you're trying to reach out to every single mind in the most perfect way you think you can. Was I going to be a rainmaker? That wasn't ever what was important to me. But I did have the hopes of building something good and maybe have the chance of building with some others too. I truly hoped there'd be enough rain to go around. To conclude, remember the precept as you move forward. Be yourself because it's all you have today and from here on out. Because these other people with power over you, they are also human. And while they might make decisions for you now and potentially down the road, should you join their institution, you still need to have the ultimate control over who you are, and what you do, all depending on where your vision and your path takes you. Now, I'm sure some of you are wondering, whatever happened to that rainmaker? Well, It wasn't long after my interview, that individual ended up relocating to a different institution, and since then has been with a handful of different institutions. So it goes to show on that day, you just don't know what's going on in the background lives of the individuals you're meeting with. But on another note, where you find yourself, and especially on the other side of the table when you're interviewing candidates or working with other folks, whether it's within or outside of your institution, act like you've been there. Be supportive, be professional, no matter what's going on in your life. And no matter whether you want to love a candidate or leave a candidate, have the grace to give the respect for that individual, the type and level of respect that any individual going through that process deserves. You deserved it too. Try to remember that. And with that, thanks so much for joining me today. And I hope you look forward to our next episode that will be released in a week's time. And no matter on which platform you heard today's episode, if you enjoyed it and want to hear more, please subscribe, follow, like, and share. And set your notifications to let you know that the next fresh episode is ready for you to dig in. All of you, keep building up your courage. Hang in there and keep your head up. We'll talk to you again soon. Continuing 30 years of experience with stories in and beyond the academic realm, Antithesis is a podcast that will take these perspectives and philosophies and pull them, along with you, the student, the researcher, the innovator, the educator, into the sunlight. Join us for some firsthand experiences, insights from inside and outside academia, and perspectives that are aimed at redefining the conventions of academia and your training, with the aim of helping you reorient your compass and strengthen you on your journey forward, or to recover and grow from those times past. We'd love to have you follow us and tune in weekly. If you have a topic you'd like discussed or a challenge you are facing you want to share, email us at allsystemsgo@gmail.com. That is ALLSYST3MSGO@gmail.com.